One of the books that I read in November is an all-time favorite. Not just an all-time favorite book of 2025. One of the books that I read this past month is an all-time favorite book across the board. It is time for my reading wrap-up for the month of November. I read 5 books in November, which is a lot for me. I'm kind of a slow reader, mostly because I have kids and other hobbies, and I get distracted easily. When I really zone in on a book and get focused, I can read fairly quickly, but I do struggle in general with consistency in my reading, and I'm trying to get better about that because there's not enough time for all of the books that I want to read in my life, and so I gotta increase the reading output. Now, obviously, I read for enjoyment, so this is not sheerly about output, but I am trying to read more than I used to. I'm trying to doom scroll less. I think you should probably read more and doom scroll less. You're allowed to watch my YouTube videos, but otherwise, let's not doom scroll so much. But anyway, yeah, 5 books this month, and one of the books that I read in November is an all-time favorite. Not just an all-time favorite book of 2025. One of the books that I read this past month is an all-time favorite book across the board. It's really that good. So let's get into what I read. We'll go through them sequentially in the order I read them, and then I will tell you later in the video which is my favorite book this month. So first up, we have The Strength of the Few by James Islington, the second book in the Hierarchy series. The Will of the Many kind of took the internet by storm a couple of years ago when it came out, and I really enjoyed The Will of the Many. It was one of my favorite fantasy books that I read in 2023. However, I wouldn't say it's like one of my all-time favorite fantasy books. It's not a top-tier series for me yet, but I do enjoy it. Strength of the Few was a very interesting read, and I'll put out a review soon, but my short thoughts on it is that I think it's a very capable follow-up to The Will of the Many, and in some ways it's better. In some ways, it's kind of disappointing. It is both a satisfying and a disappointing read for me. It's hard to explain why without getting into spoiler territory, but I will say there is a change in the status quo of the story at the end of The Will of the Many, and Book 2 has a pretty different structure for how the narrative is going. We expand the world quite a bit. We go to multiple new locations and have a few different story threads happening kind of back to back. And that expansion of the story is both what makes the book really interesting and also in some ways holds it back a little bit. James Islington continues to be a stellar world builder. I love just the creative things that he does in his worlds and the way he starts to tie things together. The magic and the science and the technology and how those things mix politically and how they tie into the plot are all really interesting. And as I said, there are a couple of different storylines in this book, and one of the downsides is that I was not equally invested in all of the storylines. Some were way more captivating than others, although by the end of the story, I started to warm up to some of the other storylines that were kind of not the primary storyline that I was the most invested in. One of my biggest issues with Islington's work continues to be how emotionally invested I am in his characters. I think in some ways this gets a little better. There was a couple of side characters that I started to grow more attached to, and I am more attached to Vis, our protagonist, but I still don't think this is one of those heavy-hitting character-focused stories like Realm of the Elderlings or something like that, and that's okay. Not everything needs to be super character-driven work, but I will say that's an area where I think this is not quite as strong. The ending of this book, super cool, raised a lot more questions. I really wish I had book 3 because I want to know where some of these things are going to go. And some of the things this book is setting up are pretty fascinating. So this is book 2 out of 4. We have a ways to go. Overall, I really did enjoy this. And I think while it didn't exceed the hype, and the hype was kind of ridiculously high, I did really enjoy my time with it. Next up, Red City by Marie Lu. This was originally kind of pitched to me as similar to the Greenbone Saga, which is a fantasy series that I adore. It's kind of a gangster urban fantasy. This is a little bit similar in the sense that this follows 2 different crime syndicates that are kind of vying for power in an alternate version of Los Angeles. It's called Angel City in the book, and it's in California, but it's kind of like an alternate version of our world. So we follow 2 different main POV characters, one on either side of this syndicate war, as these 2 syndicates are kind of fighting over control of this really valuable magical drug. That's where it feels a little bit similar to the Greenbone Saga. However, this quickly becomes a very different feeling type of story, whereas the Greenbone Saga is like this long generational family epic following a very specific like crime syndicate. This is really focused on these two characters who have more of a romantic connection. And so this started to get more into like a romance focus of the story, which I like some romance in my fantasy here and there, but this is definitely a little more romance focused than I usually like to go. So I wouldn't quite go so far as to say this is romantasy, but it has some elements that feel like they're kind of being pulled from the romantasy subgenre. So if you're not a fan of romantasy, this might not work for you. And I will also say I really enjoyed the first third or the first half of this book. I thought the initial setup for the two main characters was really well done, and I really liked the details that got me invested in these characters emotionally really quickly. But by the end of the book, I feel like the payoff of the overall plot and the antagonist was kind of lackluster, and I kind of wish it had been drawn out further. And the way this book wrapped up, there's going to be sequels. Like, this is not the end of the story, and yet I'm not quite sure where this story actually goes after this. So this is a little bit of a mixed review. I did like it. Marie Lu's a good writer, so if that sounds interesting, I do think it's worth a try. Next up, Demon in White. I was going to wait till the end of this video to reveal my favorite book of November, but I think you're probably going to figure it out by the way I talk about this book. Demon in White is the third book in the Sun Eater series by Christopher Rocchio. This was phenomenal. This was pretty much a perfect book for me. It was incredibly well paced for being like 700 and some pages. I was just flying through the pages of this book. Obviously, this is book 3, so there's not only so much I can tell you, but The Sun Eater is the story of Hadrian Marlowe, who is kind of a figure of galactic importance. From the beginning of the series, we find out he blows up a sun that kills an entire alien species along with a bunch of humans, and it's kind of chronicling his life of how he got drawn into this war with the alien Cielson and how he became an important figure in the royal court dealing with the emperor. This is very much a space opera, science fantasy. Like, this feels like epic fantasy, but obviously it's set in kind of a sci-fi setting, and book 3 really gives you everything. It's Christopher Rocchio firing on all cylinders. The plot and the action is there. There's never a dull moment, and yet we get both action and we get kind of restful, more meditative sequences. We visit some really different, cool planets and set pieces. We get some great character development for Hadrian, our main character, as well as some of the side characters. The ending sequence is so cool. We get a lot of great lore, and really this just sets the stage for how monumental this series is going to become over the subsequent 4 books. So I really love this. If you like Sun Eater and you haven't gotten to this, keep going. You're gonna have a great time. Next, I read Stoner by John Williams. Not that John Williams. This is a more literary novel, kind of a modern classic. It is about a man named Stoner who is born on a farm in the late 1800s. He grows up and ends up going to college at the University of Missouri and falls in love with teaching and scholarship and poetry and language, and he eventually becomes a teacher himself. Now, I've heard a lot of people say that this is one of their favorite books of all time. I've also heard a lot of people describe this as a book about nothing, which I think does this book quite a disservice because it's not about nothing. It's about Stoner's life. Granted, a lot of his life is kind of mundane, and I think that's what people mean by saying this is about nothing, but there can be a profoundness and pain and bittersweet and love and all of these important, powerful human emotions and feelings can happen in these mundane moments. And often it's the mundane moments that really drive home the poignancy and the relatability of the human experience. And I think that's what this book captures. Kind of the different phases of this man's life and the pain and struggles he goes through as a human, and just what that is like as he goes on to get married and have kids, become a teacher, and grow old. And we follow this man through his whole life. So I think this is beautifully told. A very simple story, but I do think this is worth reading, and it's a classic for a reason. Enshittification by Cory Doctorow is a nonfiction book. I listened to the audiobook on this one, and this is Cory Doctorow's kind of thesis on the state of the internet and why so many services on the internet have gotten so bad, because companies have made experiences worse and worse and worse. in the name of monetization. And he talks about kind of the history of tech and Facebook and all these other like the App Store, and how everything got to where we are now. And it used to be a lot of these services were really great experiences, and they captured large user bases because they provided a lot of value for free or for super cheap, often with business models that really weren't sustainable. And then they went on, once they had captured the majority of like a market, they went on to appeal to advertisers and brands and got them in by offering kind of the same thing, too good to be true outcomes to these advertisers because they had this huge captive audience. And then as these brands and advertisers kind of got locked into these ecosystems, then they could kind of pull back from that. And we are now in this place where these tech companies are just skimming money off the top from everybody, and everything kind of sucks. And I think this book really effectively captures that with Dr. O's kind of incisive insights and a little bit of humor. But I also really like that Dr. O is able to provide some hope about how can we move forward and de-shitify the internet, basically. And he kind of has coined a few different terms that capture how it feels to be on the internet. But again, there's a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel of maybe there is a world where the internet can become a little bit better, can recapture some of the great things that it had 10, 15, 20 years ago. So yeah, I recommend this if you're at all interested in the internet landscape and culture and tech in general. And finally, the last book that I read in the month of November, The Gods Below by Andrea Stewart. This is the start to a new epic fantasy series. And this is really interesting. It's set on a world where there are gods that live kind of underneath, kind of below the Earth's crust. And they kind of come above into like caves and talk to people who live on the planet. And some of these gods like come and walk among everybody. And one of these gods in particular is like reshaping the world with its magic. And it is kind of reshaping entire regions of this world. And as it does that, it transforms the people who live there into kind of like these almost animal creature human hybrids. And they have to become devoted to it and help it hunt down the other gods. So there's kind of one god from below the earth vying for power by trying to hunt down all the remaining godlike creatures from the core of this planet, while the humans that live above either have to become turned into these human-animal hybrid god hunters or get kind of enslaved or hunted down themselves. Really fascinating world building and setup. There's also these like gemstones that you can capture in essence from the lower kind of planes of the world underneath the ground. There's like the air gets more and more magical the deeper you go. And if you're a human, you can't like tolerate it. It messes with you. It kind of reminds me of if you're like scuba diving and you go too deep and you start breathing too much carbon monoxide or whatever, it can make you like disoriented. And there's a term for it that I'm totally forgetting right now. I don't even know what I'm talking about. I'm just ranting at this point, but there's this interesting idea that the air from below the earth, the lower you go, more towards the domain of the gods, makes you sick and disoriented and can even kill you or drive you insane unless you have some special abilities or protection. And there are these gemstones that you can like consume that give you that. It's a little bit convoluted, I will say. The magic system got a little complicated, and so it took a little bit of figuring out like how this all worked. And I also feel like I wasn't super connected to any of the characters, and there were multiple POVs that I was just not super invested in. So I struggled a little bit with this, but the world building was interesting enough. And there was like one character. There's these two sisters at the beginning when they're kids and they're separated and they kind of end up on two different sides of a conflict. And following their story was what was really keeping me going. So this was interesting. I am intrigued for what happens in book 2, but I also did not fully love this book. So I don't know if I'm going to continue it yet, but there are some interesting ideas in here to be sure. So that's what I've been reading. As I said, great reading month, both in terms of quantity and quality. In terms of what I've been playing, I played a little bit of Ghost of Yotei this month, which is the sequel to Ghost of Tsushima. It's a samurai game, and it's a revenge story, kind of Kill Bill style. You're hunting down a group of people who murdered your family one by one and taking them out. A very beautiful game, kind of set in a historic Japanese setting. The graphics are really pretty. The gameplay and the combat is really fun. It's kind of just more Ghost of Tsushima with a new story. So if you liked that, I think you're going to like this. If you like samurai films, this is a game that really captures that feeling. So that's been fun. That's about it on the video game front though. Because I've been reading so much lately, I haven't been playing as many games. But yeah, that was my November. Let me know in the comments, have you read any of these? What was your favorite book that you read in November? I'd love to hear.